So this is probably one of the more important videos I've done on this channel, and it also represents one of the biggest mistakes we make, at least here in the West, and that is to confuse the thinking process with consciousness. When we talk about thinking, we're talking about a biological organism that's housed in the left side of the brain. It uses language. It has a narrow focus of one thought at a time. It's a problem solver. It creates identities, selves, egos, and it's all about survival. And so it's very selfish. It's very limited in its ability to conceptualize because it uses categories and thoughts to try to figure out the world. And it's not always wrong. It has degrees of usefulness and can be really useful tool when we learn to use it as such. Consciousness, on the other hand, is beyond any category. It's beyond any conceptualization. And this is why we have the hard problem, because the thinking mind tries to take something as vast and undescribable beyond language as consciousness and tries to put it in that small little box of thinking. That's what I always say. It's like the hard problem of consciousness is like taking the universe and trying to put it into a box. And it's just an impossible process. And of course, that's why they call it the hard problem. I'd like to call it the impossible problem. But we could see that the problem itself is because we are confusing consciousness and thinking. And once you realize that consciousness does not need thinking, but thinking requires consciousness. Once you get that simple relationship between the two, you realize why it's not the hard problem, it is the impossible problem. So let me just give you a few examples here, and I'm probably going to add to this with a couple more videos. But again, one of my favorite consciousness researchers, Susan Blackmore, she's very well known, and she has this practice she has her students do where she has them write little notes around, was I just conscious? And from her perspective, really, you're not very conscious at all. You live most of your life as a zombie. And every so often you wake up and then suddenly consciousness is aware. And I think she's absolutely right. And I think it's a great practice, but it's one mistake that she's making, and that is to confuse thinking with consciousness. So consciousness is always present. It's the thinking mind that goes in and out. And so most of the time we may not be thinking. And so what I have my students do is I have them put the same notes everywhere, but it says, was I just thinking? And so you catch yourself and you realize, no, I wasn't thinking. Maybe I was involved in music, or, maybe it was just a peaceful state of non-thinking. And then all of a sudden you see the sign, was I just thinking? You're like, no, I wasn't. And so I think that's pretty cool. But again, from my view, that's a mistake, and it's very fundamental. Now, we've got the famous William James, who gave us one of the more used metaphors of the stream of consciousness. Again, super huge fan of William James. He's, 100 years plus ahead of his time, far before we had any kind of experimental EEGs and MRIs. But he described consciousness as a stream, and it's really not consciousness. Consciousness is far more captured by the metaphor of stillness. Thinking is a stream, and so if you observe the thinking mind, you'll see that it is one continuous chatter of chaos that just goes from one topic to another. So it's not the stream of consciousness, it's the stream of thinking. And maybe the most profound one for me was a book that I read in graduate school, and I don't know if you're familiar with it. I've talked about it on the channel a couple times. It's Daniel Dennett, and it's Consciousness Explained. And at some point, I'm going to find it, and I described to people how frustrating it was reading it, and I ended up ripping it up in several sections. And all the frustration came about because of this fundamental mistake. If Dennett had simply titled the book Thinking Explained, I think it would have been an absolutely fantastic description of a very insightful book about the thinking process itself. And even his basic idea of the multiple drafts, which I've talked about in several videos, it's an excellent way to think about thinking. It's an excellent theory on the thinking process itself. But the book, of course, says nothing about consciousness. And from his perspective, he just assumes that it doesn't exist. And that is because, again, it's so easy for us to confuse thinking and consciousness and get so involved in the thinking process that if there is no thinking, we simply assume there is no consciousness. And so that's just a couple examples. I'll come back, and maybe you've got some. You could drop an example in the comments. But we're going to go through this. It may take a while, but I'm convinced that by the end, once you experience for yourself how fundamentally different thinking and consciousness are, it will make a huge impact on meditation, yoga, tai chi, whatever forms of practice that you have, and it will really profoundly affect this experiment that we're doing here.